Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening.
You can dance and you can jive, having the time of your life. See that girl, watch that scene, dig in the dancing queen. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to What I Know Now. I am your host, Brick City Brown Chick, and this is episode 15, Dance, Dance, Dance. The story goes from my parents when I was a very young girl, 3, 4 years old. My mother came to the realization, to her absolute horror, that I was clumsy. I don't know what that meant exactly, like I tripped over stuff or I fell a lot. I'm not sure what her interpretation of that was, but she noticed or thought I was clumsy, and that she and my father had a duty to do something about that as my parents. Now, I'm not sure what kind of decision I would have made if I had a child that young and thought they were clumsy. I might have just thought, oh, maybe they'll grow out of it. But that's not how my mother rolls. Once she sees a problem, she's a problem solver. She's going to solve the problem. So she went to the library and did her research because, again, this was the 1970s, pre-internet. I know it's hard to believe, but she went to the library and did her research and did some thinking. And after a period of time, she came back to my father and said, okay, as far as this her being clumsy issue, I've narrowed it down to 2 things that we can enroll her in. Here's our choices. Our choices are gymnastics or ballet. And my father thought about it for a couple of minutes, and then, being the practical and pragmatic man that he was, he said, well, if you think she's clumsy, I really don't think jumping off a 4-inch beam is a good idea. So ballet it was. So as a 4-year-old, my mother entered me into ballet classes. Now, as a 4-year-old, I was, today we'd call it introverted. When I was a kid, it was called shy. I was a painfully shy kid because I'd spent the first 4 years of my life around just adults. My cousins are significantly older than me. So I wasn't used to being around other children, which was another reason my mother thought ballet class was a good idea, because I'd have to learn to interact with kids before I went to even preschool. So I wanted no part of this at all. And I've also been told that I had serious meltdowns when my mother would drop me off at ballet class at 4. I would literally get on the floor and yell and scream and kick and cry. Now, my mother's instinct to deal with that would have been to snatch me up, drag me out, and tell me, yeah, we're not doing this in public. But that was not my dance teacher style. my dance teacher, who was the woman who owned the studio, said, listen, all little kids start out like this. She'll get over it. She'll get used to it. You as a parent cannot stay. I teach these classes without parents on purpose. She'll get over it. And apparently it took me 4 or 5 months of going to these lessons every week, but I finally got in the headspace of, okay, my mother's not just leaving me here. She'll be back. And I did get over it. So my teacher was right about that. Something you have to understand at the very beginning of this story is that people who make their living as dance instructors are crazy. And I don't mean crazy in the they're not right in their general life. I mean crazy when it comes to dancing and rules and how you do things and how you present yourself. If you ever saw the TV show Dance Moms when it was on several years ago, a lot of people had horrible reactions to the woman who ran the studio because they thought, how can she treat children this way? How can she talk to parents this way? She's got to be out of her mind. They thought it was an anomaly. And I was very glad to tell people, no, most dance teachers are like that. That's how they get the best out of your kids. They're super focused, and this is how they do things. So it took me probably 2 to 3 years to really get comfortable with dancing. Now, over those 2 to 3 years, there were several rounds and rounds with my mother about, oh, I want to quit this. Oh, I don't want to do this. Oh, I don't like Miss Marie's rules. And I can use her name because she is gone from this world. She died a few years ago. So there were several rounds and rounds of that. And my mother's rule was always, okay, you can quit. I don't have a problem with that, but you have to finish the year. You cannot quit mid-year, toward the end of the year. You can't do that. You are going to finish the year, and then we can have a conversation over the summer about whether you're going to go next year. And that's one of the things I know now that has been super effective and super positive in my life is not giving up in the middle, no matter how hard the journey is. And some years, my journey with dance was incredibly hard. My dance instructor was a former ballerina herself. I thought for most of my life that she was a very, very light-skinned Black woman. I mean, she looked like a white woman, but her studio was in East Orange, New Jersey, which back in the 70s was probably 60 to 70% Black. 95% of the kids who went to the school were Black. So it really never crossed my mind that she might not be Black. It wasn't until she died a few years ago and I read her obituary that I came to the realization that no, she was a white woman. She was a white woman who started a dance school for Black children in a Black neighborhood because she thought that was important. She thought that Black children should have the same opportunities, especially to become classical dancers. That was extremely important to her. And in that way, she was radically ahead of her time. In the 1970s and through the 80s, to a lesser extent today, but it still does exist, a lot of people really do have the thought and the vision that Black bodies are not designed for classical dancing. So not designed to dance Swan Lake, not designed to dance the Nutcracker. Any other sort of classical ballet you can think of, people felt black bodies were just too massive, too heavy, just not designed for that. It's the same sort of nonsense thinking that people have had about black people being able to swim. A lot of people think because black people tend to be shorter and stockier and our bodies look heavier, that we would get into a pool and drown or sink, that we're not meant to swim. And of course, that's nonsense. I know lots of people know how to swim. I know how to swim. But it's just how people thought. And this was very prevalent in the 1970s. Alvin Ailey had a lot to do with changing that perspective. If you've never seen the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, I highly recommend them. They are amazing. But one of the reasons he started his company is because he was told by directors and choreographers in white companies that he was, a breathtaking, amazing dancer, but they couldn't cast him as anything but in the chorus. They could never cast him as the lead because people who went to ballet would not understand, would not appreciate, and some people would even be reviled by the fact that he was a black man dancing a lead in ballet. So the 70s, when I was a kid and going to dance classes, was full of all kinds of crazy nonsense like that. So my instructor was super committed to ensuring that black children had access to the types of dance that she grew up with, because she was a classically trained ballerina and had been a professional dancer. The aspect of her teaching that made her crazy, among other things, is she used to use a yardstick, which for people who've never seen one is a long ruler. It's 36 inches, so it's 3 feet. And whenever you do warm-ups for ballet, you sit on the floor, you spread your legs apart as far as you can get them apart, and then you take your upper body, you pull your hands over your head, and you pull yourself over and get your stomach and your head as close to the floor as possible. Yes, that is as hard as it sounds. It's not easy and it's not fun. And it's something you practice over time so that you get more limber. Well, she would walk around with a yardstick and measure how many inches our stomachs were off the floor. And if that got better from week to week, that's how she'd know we were practicing at home or not. And then sometimes she would use the yardstick and the back of one of her hands to press on our backs to get us closer to the floor. Did that hurt? Yes. Is that something parents would tolerate from their children's dance teacher these days? Probably not. But it was the 70s and the parents are like, okay, she knows what she's doing. So yeah, that made her crazy. And the other aspect that made her crazy was she had an obsession about weight and what we all would look like in our, we took pictures every year. So in our dance photos and in our dance recital, we had a big recital every year in a place called Symphony Hall, which is in Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from, which is still there. I think it's a national landmark at this point. But we had this big show every year, and all the parents and all the friends and all the cousins and like everybody who knew you and knew you went to dance class would come to your dance recital. So it was a very big thing. Our teacher had a disconnect between who we were as Black children, in other words, what we were shaped like, what we looked like, versus her training as a dancer. And now that I know she was a white woman, I have a better understanding of what went on when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I didn't get what the deal was. So I danced at that school from the time I was 4 until the year I left for college when I was 18. So I was there for double-digit years, a long time. And in that time, there were 2 years that I was not allowed to dance in the recital because I was overweight. Now you're going to ask, how did I know I was overweight? My dance teacher told me. There was always 2 or 3 of us that were what she always called borderline. So we were always on the fence about whether we were going to make weight that year or not. And what that involved was every week before class, the 2 or 3 or 4 of us who were on the borderline would get called into a back room and put on a scale. And based on what we weighed, she would decide, oh, you need to lose 5 pounds, or oh, you're going to need to lose 10 pounds. I don't think it was ever over 10 pounds, but there was always tension with the kids, with us, and with our mothers, because my mother especially felt very much like, I'm paying for these lessons. I'm paying you to teach her how to dance, not paying you to try to be a doctor and regulate her weight. But I'm sure my mother had some words with my instructor on a couple of occasions, but that's not something they ever involved me in. So, as a kid, from my perspective, I always kind of felt like, okay, I'm not going to make weight. And what is this about? It was something that was very, as an introverted kid, it was something that was very hurtful for me because I felt like all my friends were dancing. Now, all these other girls, for the most part, were skinny, but I was like, all my other friends are dancing. I can do the same things they do. What does my weight have to do with any of this? So at first I was confused. And as I got older, what happened is I became angry about it because it doesn't feel good to be purposely excluded from a group you're in because of what you look like. So that was one of the first hardcore lessons in my life in learning that you're not always going to belong, or people are going to look at you as not belonging because of, in this case, your size. I always been a chubby girl. Always. That's not new. It's not something that happened in my 20s or 30s or 40s. Lady Gaga says I was born this way. Yeah, I was born this way. I mean, I think I was like 7.5 pounds when I was born. But as I got to be 4, 5, 6, 7, I was always a chubby little girl. And that was never an issue for anybody else except my dance instructor. So I really did have this love-hate relationship with dance for a long time. Even though I loved going to class, I loved learning new things. The way the dance school worked is we took combination classes as very young children. So a combination class was we learned ballet moves, we learned ballet, tap, and jazz. And yeah, there's nothing like a bunch of 5-year-olds with tap shoes to just make you want to run screaming away. But that's how it worked. And then when we got to be 9, maybe 10, we were allowed to choose what we wanted to specialize in. So a couple of years, I did jazz, which was super fun. I think now it's called like, I have no idea, Afro-Caribbean maybe, or hip hop dancing. This was like the precursor to hip hop. We wore those white, what we used to call pumpkin seed sneakers. I think now they're just Keds, like the all white really small sneakers, and that's what we danced in. So I did jazz for a couple of years, but I really did love ballet. It opened up a world for me that I was not used to seeing on a regular basis because, again, ballet was the dance that was sort of exclusive to white people. So the fact that I could learn the moves and learn to do the moves and really get into it and enjoy it was super important. So by the time I was probably 13 or 14, by the time I entered high school, I had really made peace with the whole, okay, am I going to dance in the recital this year? I don't know, we'll see, but I'm not going to obsess about it. I'm not going to go crazy and try to go on some ridiculous diet. And yes, I did do a couple of ridiculous diets when I was younger. So that's another thing I know now is I have a lot of empathy for, tween girls and teenage girls who are dealing with social media and with television and all the images that they see and trying to look like a certain person or look a certain way. That was not as prevalent when I was young. I had a subscription to Glamour magazine from the time I was like 10 years old. And I would look through it and look at the clothes and ooh and ah things, but I was never under any illusion or delusion, depending on how you want to look at it, that I was ever going to look like that because 98% of the people in those magazines, even in the early 80s, were white. So I knew instinctively that as a young Black girl, I was never going to look like that. And that was not a goal for me. But that didn't mean that I didn't have all the insecurities that tween girls and teenage girls have. I think mine were probably worse than a lot of the kids I knew because I got my first bra at 8.5. That was the clue. That was the warning sign that puberty was coming. I was 8.5. But I think everybody was in denial about it. My mother, me, especially my dad. We were all totally in denial. So when, as we like to call it, Aunt Flo showed up right after my 10th birthday, my mother was horrified and freaked out because she was 16. So in a generation, it had gone from 16 to 10. That was not a fun time for any of us, but because I went through puberty so early, I had much longer than most of the girls I knew to deal with, the trials and tribulations and emotions of what you look like and all that fun stuff. So, in that way, dancing, especially when I was in high school, became a refuge for me. I've mentioned before that I went to an all-girl Catholic high school, and I'll do an episode on that later on, but it was a trip. That's what I'm going to say. And it was a very competitive school. Everybody was competitive about everything. And so after you've had a day of that, you just want to be able to like go somewhere and turn your mind off and not think about all that craziness. And dance allowed me to do that, even though it was not a place where I could turn my brain off because I had to focus and I had to concentrate, but it allowed me to loosen up and to not be so stressed and so frustrated with my school day and my life that way. Another thing I know now about how important dance was to me is I had an epiphany, I don't know, probably halfway through high school, that I had spent a lot of years learning technique and learning steps, because that's what you do when you take dance classes. Everybody learns, you learn technique and you learn steps. And what taking classes does not teach you, because it cannot teach you this, is the joy of dancing and being able to embrace dance as an art form. You are so focused in your class on step 1, 2, 3, plie, turn, jump spin, jump spin. You're so focused on this step, this step, this step, this step, this step, that you don't really get the joy of what dance is. And about halfway through high school, I had that moment of clarity, like, oh, wait. This is more than just steps and technique. This can also be fun and joyous and happy. And so by the time I finished taking classes when I was 18, I had really come to embrace the joy of dancing and understand what dance had meant in my life, that it allowed me to move in ways that a lot of people thought I could not move. It allowed me to enjoy types of technique and types of music that I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise. So I'm very grateful that out of my clumsy beginnings, that my parents made the decision to put me in dance. The great thing about dance is it's something you can do for the rest of your life. Had my parents taken that other fork in the road and put me in gymnastics classes, that would have been long past. I'm not sure I would have even gotten into double digits as a gymnast. But as a dancer, I can still do a lot of the steps that I did way back in the day. I still remember their names. I still remember the technique. I know how to do them. Now, some of them I can't do anymore. That's just an age thing. But it's amazing to me how much I still remember. Or when I go to a dance performance and I see people perform, I'm like, oh, I used to do that, or I know what that step is. So that's been super good for my life. The other way it's been really good for me is I have no problem jumping up at a party or a wedding reception or a club, like you name it. If it's a song I like, I'm jumping out on the floor and I'm having a good time. I have no thoughts or no embarrassment or no like, oh, people are going to be looking at me. I honestly don't care. Like, I'm there to have a good time. And if it's a song I like, I'm getting out on the dance floor. Thankfully, my husband is of a similar mind that way. He's never been trained to dance. Dancing, I think he enjoys dancing, but like it's not a thing for him the way it is for me. I remember for our 15th wedding anniversary, we had this big party. So it was a combination party. It was a 15th wedding anniversary party for us, and it was an 80th birthday party for my mother. And so we had this big thing, family, friends, and my husband and I decided, which interpret that as I decided, this wouldn't have been his idea, that we were going to do, let's call it an interpretive dance. Now, not a super interpretive dance, but we were going to do this choreographed, that's probably a better word, choreographed dance. And I had like 3 songs spliced together, and we were going to do all these steps. And after about a week of practicing, he looked at me and said, okay, listen, I'm totally on board with doing this, but my mind doesn't work the way yours does. I cannot keep all these steps in my head in order, and then you want me to do them, but then you also want me to smile and look up and not look at my feet and not trip over you. Like, there are way too many variables involved in this for me. So, okay, great. We simplified it It was much better. Everybody loved it. We had fun doing it. But I definitely had to go, okay, stop being unreasonable. Be glad that he's willing to do this. You have to work within his limitations. So that was super funny. But he was just like, yeah, you're obviously professionally trained, and you have thoughts and feelings that I can do things that I can't actually do. So let's simplify. Let's keep it simple. So I wanted to let people know that when you as a parent find something for your child, if it's something that your child loves, your child will keep doing it. My parents were lucky that they hit it out of the park on the first try. That doesn't always happen. My mother wanted me to be a Girl Scout at one point in my life, and I flat out refused. And I said I was not camping in the woods, I was not learning to sew, and I didn't need to learn how to cook because I wasn't going to get married and I wasn't going to take care of a man, so that was not a thing. I think I might have been 8, maybe 9. She just sort of stared at me like, what is happening? Like, how did I get this kid? This kid's a trip and a half. I'm sure she's thought that several times over the course of my life. But it's really important as parents that you listen to your children, that you look at their strengths and weaknesses and point them toward their strengths. There is a sort of psychology thought process that's called Strength Finders. So if you have the opportunity to do that in your teens or as an adult, it's something I highly recommend. And I think there are 34 strengths that have been established that people have. And you take an assessment, and what Strength Finders does is the assessment focuses on the things you are good at. And once you finish the assessment and it gets run through a computer, and then you have a Strength Finders expert, person who teaches this, break down your 5 top strengths and what they mean. And it is a radically different way of looking at what people are capable of than when I was a child or a teenager. It used to be people would say, focus on the things you're not good at and get better at them. Strength Finders flips that on its head and says, no, focus on the things you're good at and get better at them. And so that has been a hugely perspective changing point for me. And the way I apply that in my everyday life, the way I think about it is, for years, my teachers and my tutors and my parents said, okay, you're not great at math. We only need you to work on this so you can get good at math. Am I good at math now? Nope. Spent years doing it. Now, can I do basic things? Absolutely. Add, subtract, multiply, divide, balance a checkbook, like all those sorts of things. But what they were talking about were things like algebra and calculus and things that I had to take because I was required to take them, but never got good at them and have never used them since high school. So it's super important that as early as possible with your children, that you see their strengths, you see what they're interested in and what they want to focus on, and that you pour your energy into that so that they will pour their energy into that. My mother didn't take dance as a child. Dancing, I know my parents used to throw parties and go to parties. I don't know that dancing was ever really my mother's thing. I can't remember a function where I saw her up and dancing, except at my wedding, and that was like waltzing, stuff like that. But she was willing to take me to class and make sure I practiced and make sure I learned my steps and all that sort of thing. She made sure that I could be the best I could be at this thing that I enjoyed and loved. So that's my tip for parents, keeping in mind that I do have a philosophy that goes, the last thing people who have children want is advice on how to raise their children from people who don't have any. That's my personal philosophy, but that is the one tip I'd give parents is see what your child is interested in and what they're good in and pour that energy into them so that they will pour that energy into what they love and enjoy and they will get better at it. I'm not saying they'll ever be professional. I was never a professional dancer and didn't have that ambition. But being a 4-year-old thrust into a combination dance class has made me a 53-year-old woman who still loves to dance. And I think that's super cool. So I hope everybody enjoyed this week's episode. It's hard to believe we're at episode 15. If you have enjoyed this episode, please sign up for the podcast. You can do that anywhere you get your podcast, Amazon, Spotify, Apple, all those places, and a bunch more. If you can't find What I Know Now, or you find there are 4 or 5 podcasts with this name, you'll see a cartoon version of me with a big afro. That's this podcast. It's under Brick City Brown Chick. If you prefer to watch the podcast on YouTube, you can go to my YouTube channel, also Brick City Brown Chick, and the podcast will pop up. Thank you, everybody, for joining this week, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.